I'd like to welcome Daniel Olivas. He'll be moderating tonight's program. Daniel is the grandson of Mexican immigrants. He lives in Southern California with his wife. He has an adult son. They have an adult son. Daniel received a degree in English literature from Stanford and a law degree from UCLA. By day, he's an attorney, and by evening, I guess he does all the rest of this work. I don't know. Daniel, you must not sleep, is all I can say. Because in his spare time, he's a writer, an editor, an anthologist, a poet, and a playwright. He's the author of 10 books. His latest is How to Date a Flying Mexican, New and Collected Stories. Daniel's written for a long list of journals and periodicals like the New York Times, the LA Times, the Huffington Post, and the Jewish Journal. That's just a few. There's a long list. Daniel wrote his first full-length play, Waiting for Godinas, in 2019, and he adapted his first novel, The Book of Want, for the stage in 2021. We'll be putting links in the chat tonight for places where you can buy both Daniel's and Rubén's books. So please take a look at those when they come along. Daniel, I hope I haven't missed mentioning anything important in all the moments of your very busy life.
No, Karen, it was lovely the way you present my resume, but I have to tell people I don't golf, so that's how I find
time. Fair enough.
and well, I don't, and I rely upon caffeine and chocolate. How's that?
Oh yes, that's a favorite of mine too. So I do hear that How to Date a Flying Mexican is really funny and very poignant, and so I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
So I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, Karen, thank you so much. So gracious of you, and many thanks to the friends of the Alameda Free Library for allowing me this wonderful honor of being able to introduce you folks to Rubén Degollado's newest book, his beautiful, gorgeous novel, The Family Izquierdo, and it's also a beautiful cover. Published by W.W. Norton, and is, if many of you may be English majors, recent perhaps, or maybe long ago, and almost every English major used a Norton anthology. So W.W. Norton is really the gold standard when it comes to literature. Let me tell you a little bit about Rubén. Rubén has published his writing in various journals, including The Common, Texas Highways, Beloit Fiction Journal, Gulf Coast, Hayden's Ferry Review, Image, and in the recent anthologies, Living Beyond Borders and Nepatla Familias. He has written 2 novels, one titled Throw, and the other, The Family Izquierdo, both set in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, where he and his family have lived for generations. So with no further ado, please welcome Rubén Degollado. Hello, Rubén.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Delighted to be here. Delighted to be here. And as a true writer, I see you have a bookshelf filled with books.
Yeah.
Tonight, we're going to be discussing your beautiful new novel, The Family Izquierdo. I love this book. It's a gorgeous, rich, big-hearted novel that follows the lives of the fictional Izquierdo family of McAllen, Texas. And you've already received some wonderful reviews. Publishers Weekly dubbed it a gem, gave it a starred review. Kirkus Reviews also gave it a starred review and pronounced it a instant Tejano classic. And one of our favorite writers, I know he's my favorite, maybe my favorite, maybe I can say that without offending anyone. Luis Alberto Urrea said that anyone with a family will find themselves in these pages. And late breaking news, just today, the New York Times gave this beautiful novel a rave review and observed that, quote, the novel's mix of elements, a plot that draws on magic, language steeped in Tejano specificity, deftly rendered insight into the nature of humanity, makes for a thoroughly satisfying read. And it is, in fact, a thoroughly satisfying read.
Thank you.
that I could not put down. So I wholeheartedly agree with all those words of praises from those wonderful different sources. So before we jump into some questions that I've come up with about to talk about your novel, how about if we kick off tonight with a little reading of your choice from your novel?
Great. Thank you. And thank you for that. I'm going to read a little bit from the back cover copy, so it'll give context to what I'm about to read. When Gonzalo digs up a strange object in the backyard of the family home, the Izquierdos take it as proof that a jealous neighbor has cursed them. Could this be the reason for all their troubles? As the Izquierdos face a distressing present and an uncertain future, they are sustained by the blood that binds them, a divine presence, and abiding love for one another. So that's to set the scene. The very beginning of the book sets it off. The family, Gonzalo, has the oldest son has hired a curandero, which is a folk healer, to unearth some curses that they believe to be in the yard. Witnessing this is Victoria, Gonzalo's wife, little Gonzalo, and the grandmother, Abuelita Valentina Izquierdo. And the narrator is little Gonzalo, a boy of about 9 years old, looking back. Through the lace curtains, I could see my father following the curandero. The man walked a circle holding a small medallion of San Cristobal. The healer held it out in front of him like some kind of divining rod. The medallion was still, but began swaying when he reached a spot directly under Susana's open window near my grandmother's mesquite tree. Here, he said. My mother came up behind me and watched what they were doing, praying under her breath, the heat from it feeling good on the top of my head. We have to cleanse the area before we dig out the entierro. Your mother has prepared the tools. You must get them from her. I did not like the way this man ordered my father around and thought Apa was going to tell the curandero to get the tools himself, but he came back with a shovel and a galvanized metal bucket. He set them down and looked at the healer for instructions. I had never seen my father act this way. At barbecues and parties, and whenever he was working on Abuelita's home, Apa, being the oldest son, was always the one to lead his brothers, assigning the jobs, giving the orders. The curandero said, "Give me the knives and the alcohol." He placed the kitchen knives on the ground in the form of an inverted cross. My mother gasped and said, "God protect you, viejo." The curandero then poured alcohol over the knives and told my father to kneel with him. The curandero lit the ground with matches, starting a weak blue fire. He then began the Apostles' Creed with Apa joining in. As they recited their beliefs, I realized that from where they were, the cross looked right. The fire died down, and the curandero said, "It's ours now. You must dig around the entierro without disturbing it." My father got up and kicked the shovel, cutting a circle into the earth. Once he finished, the soil inside the circle collapsed as if the ground had long been ready to unburden itself. The man sifted through the earth and rocks, then found the entierro. My father moved away as a curandero stood and cleared dirt from something in his hand. "What is it?" Apa asked. The curandero held out something square and black wrapped in plastic. "It is the picture of a man and a boy, probably you and your father." With this, Apa snatched it from the curandero. Later, my father would explain that it had indeed been a photograph of him and Papatavo. Brujo Contreras had punched 2 nails through the picture, piercing an X through the torsos of Papatavo and my father, the oldest patriarchs, crossing out our entire Izquierdo bloodline. "We must burn it," the healer said. "I wouldn't doubt the curandero put them there himself," Mama said, and turned to me. "Mijo, promise you'll never get into it. Curanderismo and brujeria. Promise me." I looked into the pitch of her eyes, now mingled with something like sorrow, and it became blood to me. I said, "Yes, Mama." "You have to promise to Jesus, mijo," she said, and squeezed my hands in hers. "I promise, Mama. I promise to Jesus." Her grip relaxed and she said, "Good, mijo. Everything's going to be good for you now." The curandero explained that my father would have to burn it himself since he was the oldest son and closest to being the head of the household. Papa laid the portrait in the metal bucket. He poured alcohol over the entierro, lit a match, and dropped it in. It sputtered out. My father lit another, then another, his anger growing with every failure. The obscenity began slowly, under his breath, as if my father were a child saying the words for the first time. The maldiciones became more specific, directed at the Brujo Contreras down the block. In Spanish, Apa damned all of the Brujos family to hell, where they would watch their father be eaten alive forever. The only time I'd ever heard my father curse was the few times when he drank liquor, which seemed to have a different effect on him than beer. Where beer mostly put him in a relaxed mood, hard liquor made him defensive and suspicious of everyone. Mama covered my ears and spoke in tongues even louder, trying to drown out his cursing. Although I did not know all of the words he was saying, I could still hear him, and I understood what he meant. Apa was yelling now, the veins in his neck throbbing and thick. His head was thrown back, and I could see spit catching the light, which filtered through the thorny mesquite branches. The fire started, much like Apa's cursing, slow at first and then engulfing the entierro. As my father cursed the Brujo Contreras, fire lighting up his face, dogs in the neighborhood began to bark. At first, it was just dogs in the houses nearby, but soon all of the Zavala's dogs were howling like they do when they hear a police siren. Some of the barking was desperate but vicious, like that of little dogs who had been cornered. Through the chain link fence of the house next door, I saw Teddy Ramirez's half-breed Doberman, teeth bared, the fur on its back standing up. It barked like it wanted to get at Apa. Under the howling, the curandero said, "They're barking because they sense the evil spirits leaving your family." "Gracias," Apa said. "Gracias a Dios." He was calmer now. My mother put my head on her lap and stroked my hair. "Shh, mijito, it's okay," she said, because I was shaking and crying now. Mama began singing in tongues, and this was the first and only time I ever understood all of what she said, not just a few words here and there. It was this, over and over, coming, not leaving, coming, not leaving, in her sad sing-song way. Thank you.
Wow. Oh, I love that scene. I remember when I was reading your book and I came to that scene, it gave me chills. For those of us who grew up in the Mexican culture, for many of us at least, this connection to the other world is very powerful and very natural.
Mhm.
And this battle between good and evil, we recognize it in not only a very physical way, but also we recognize it in a very spiritual way. Whether or not any of us is necessarily particularly religious, it is definitely part of our culture. And just in that one chapter, it demonstrates that your novel was filled with such wonderful, fully realized characters. In fact, you have such a large cast in your novel. You have, and I appreciated this. You have a family tree,
Mhm.
which I think is wonderful, because it is such a large cast, and the chapters alternate between voices, and so it kind of helps you situate within that tree, and within the generations, because it's a multi-generational book. So before delving into some craft questions, and I love talking about craft with another writer, can you talk with us, what inspired you to write this novel?
Well, I'll read a statement from the very beginning of the book, and I'll let you interpret it as you will. Author's note: although some of these stories were sparked by family lore, This is a work of fiction, and the usual rules apply. None of the characters are real. All names, characters, events, and incidents are products of my imagination.
As a lawyer, I appreciated that. Don't sue me, anybody.
So I'll tell you what inspired. So I will say this. Some of the events that happen in the book are inspired by real events. I do have a large family. We have lots of stories within the family. And so I come from, perhaps like you, Daniel, I come from a very strong storytelling background. As we sat around drinking coffee, sat around the fire on the few cool nights we have down here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, lots of stories flowed, and I heard lots of those, and they were just ripe for telling story. So what inspired me was the stories I'd heard, things that I knew that had happened to people that we knew, and I thought, these are the types of stories I don't want to die. I want those stories to continue. I want them to become sort of almost like our mythos here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. I want to keep that going.
I love that. That's beautiful. It reminds me of something my mother said. My mother's 90. And one time she was reading one of my books, and she said, Mijo, in that story, it didn't quite happen that way. And I said, Mom, remember, this is fiction. Oh, that's right. Okay. I did recognize your uncle in that story. Yes, but
That's right.
But you're right. It's chronicling in one of the reasons why your novel is so beautiful. It chronicles people from a very specific place, McAllen, Texas, with Mexican roots, and so some people would say that in order to really learn of an area and the people, don't read history books, read the novels and the short stories and the plays that come out of those communities. Your novel, one of the reasons why it's so beautiful is that it has so many different voices. It's almost like a chorus, and it's made up of interconnected short stories. So how did you decide upon this structure? Because these pieces could have been sort of like a jazz album. You could have put them in different places, and it would have had maybe a different tone or different texture. How did you structure it in this way, and how did you situate these different stories in the order that you did?
Well, the order. So I'll say this: they did start out as short stories, right? But you have a connective thread, and the connective thread is, number one, the family, hence the title, right? And the second connective thread, I would say, is you have these vignettes of this grandfather, Octavio Izquierdo Papatavo, interspersed throughout the novel, and those are connections to the past, the man that he was, so that as we're in the present, you see what has been lost. You really feel that loss because you see the man he now is. And so the way I ordered everything was chronological. And I did follow a standard story format where I have an inciting incident. You'll notice that story Turroco is the inciting incident where they unbury or they unearth this thing from the ground. I have a conflict in the middle of the story, a confrontation between the brujo and one of the daughters. And then you have, very much so the falling action and the result at the end of it. So that's kind of how I structured it. I could have put him any which way, but the way I did it was such a way is that kind of in between are these quiet moments, where you see Maggie cutting hair, working miracles on somebody in her chair. You also see a birthday party where the eldest grandson goes to visit the grandfather. And then again, you have those that story structure. So that's how I did it. And then the other question you had, I think, was about like all the narrators, right?
Yes.
So like I said, it is a big family. There are 10 brothers and sisters. And then they have children. So there's even more. And that's I'm actually undercounting it when I think about my own family, because I come from 13. brothers and
Wow.
sisters on one side. I have 13, 13 uncles and aunts on one side. A few of them have gone on to glory, but and then I have 7 on the other side. And from that, I learned that everybody has a voice. Everyone in my family has a unique voice. They have a unique character and personality. And even though we're all related, everybody is very unique and individual. And so I wanted to bring that to the page. So when you're hearing Maggie narrate a story, you know that's Maggie. You don't even have to see it's Maggie. You know, it's like at a party when you hear someone's laughter at the other end of the room. And if you know them and you love them, you know exactly who that is, right? Or they can say a key phrase. That's something Tia Maggie would say. Or over here, Marisol, she was the one that would say, I just don't know what to do with this. And, she'll go on and say something else. So that's kind of why I wanted to honor just all the voices, the wonderful, beautiful, unique voices in a family, and do it in such a format that you fall in love with them too.
I love that. I love that. Just so you know, it seems like your microphone might be rubbing on your shirt.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of a noise. So
right.
I don't want to disturb. Yeah, I think that's way better.
Okay.
Good, thank you. The technology of, living with this technology is, we make do. We do fine, and I love that response because, in reading your novel, it reminded me. Like Luis Soraya said, I see my family in these stories as well, and so it's very moving. It was very moving for me to read it. Your novel very honestly and eloquently includes neurodiverse characters, which is unusual in some ways, and certainly unusual to have such have it done with such caring and such non-stereotypical language. Could you talk a little bit about your weaving of this element into your narratives?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. I hadn't been asked that question, but I appreciate it because I did put care into that, and it's good to hear your response about that. So I'll start off with, I'm an educator. I'm a former teacher, former principal, and I had a lot of neurodiverse students in my classes. And so I saw the beauty, I saw the challenges, and as a reader of Latino fiction, Chicano fiction, unless I'm missing something, I have not seen neurodiversity represented in literary fiction in quite the way that I have it in there. So I'll say that, and then on the other side of it, I'm an autism dad. I have children on the spectrum, and I wanted to bring that to the page. And so to me, that was an important thing because I don't think that's a topic that a lot of Chicanos or Latinos talk about as much. Just like you see in the book, there's, I try to talk more about mental health than I've seen in some books. So to me, that was very important to get it right. And so as I was writing, and you're probably talking about the haircut scene.
Yes.
With Teddy.
Absolutely. Beautiful scene. Absolutely powerful, honest, truthful scene. Maybe you could describe it just a little bit, just so the audience can know what we're talking about.
Yeah, so there's a vignette where Maggie, who has dubbed herself Maggie Magic Fingers because she's an artist in cosmetology, right? She's a barber. There's a scene where as a child, she was her dad's barber assistant, and they had a little neighbor named Teddy, and he had his hair long. And so his mother wasn't able to cut his hair anywhere because none of the barbers in town would deal with him because he would just, he would start stimming and having meltdowns every time he would try to go to a barber. So he had his hair long, and everybody in the neighborhood thought he had what's called a promesa. And if you're not familiar with the promesa, it's called a promise. And it's a tradition where a parent will keep their child's hair long until a prayer is answered. And so that's what everybody thinks, but the mother wants to cut his hair, just she can't do it. So anyway, they bring him over, and Maggie helps Octavio, the grandfather, her father, cut the child's hair, and Octavio does it in such a loving way where he gets he holds the lion and he makes sure he cuts the hair, but he does it in such a way with love and care. And then later on, Maggie has the experience of actually seeing Teddy again in her chair as an adult many years later.
Yeah.
And so she applies that care and love to Teddy. So that's the background behind that. But yeah, that to me, that was something because like I said, I have firsthand experience with that with my family. It's something I wanted to do with as much love and care as I could, and show how we can respond as humans, as people that are neurotypical, and I'm using air quotes in case you're not watching, that using that love and care and being able to treat them with dignity and love and respect, and just being human about it.
Well, that honesty, and as I said, there's a great care in the storytelling that you employ that is not judgmental. It is, you're telling the story. You're depicting the situations, and for those of us who have neurodiverse loved ones or friends, it just, to me, it came across as being not only expertly written, but also very honest, and I appreciated that.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, when did you start writing this novel? Because believe me, I know, being the author of many books, I know some books longer to write than others, and I get the sense this started a long time ago.
Yeah, it did, and you sensed correctly. So the first story that I wrote in this series of stories was Turroco. It's the first story in the collection. And I wrote that story about 25 years ago as a young writer, 25 or so. I wrote it and I got it published in Hayden's Fair Review. And that was probably the bigger, like my first literary magazine that was a bigger, more reputable, I guess. So I wrote that story, and then over the years, every year or so, I think like the second story I wrote was another Izquierdo story. I think it was Host, was probably the second one, also dealing with Victoria. And then what I found very quickly was I was writing everything I was writing was about this one family. I just kept coming back to them and coming back to them and writing a story about Maggie and other characters, and they started to come to life. And then I realized at some point I had, in my mind, I envisioned it as a collection of short stories. And that's kind of what I had put together. But it's a large canvas, right? So you have these 10 siblings, their kids, the grandparents. And so this is large canvas to just tell all kinds of stories about this one family. And I can see myself actually going on, for the rest of my career, just writing about this one family and, having offshoots here and there, certainly, but writing about them. So yeah, about 25 years. And then maybe I would say about 10 years ago, I started submitting it to places, and I didn't place it successfully anywhere. And then somewhere in there, I had started writing a short story about Cirilo, the teenage boy, the oldest grandson, and behind me, above my head, right up there, I started that as a short story about him, and it actually turned into a novel. So that's the first Izquierdo book, Throw, which is technically, it's a young adult book, but it tells a story about him. And then you get to see the family and all the other stories, the chapters that you see in the Family Izquierdo.
Yeah, so a lot of blood and sweat and tears, 25 years went into this beautiful novel. You use a lot of Spanish in your novel, which I love. As a Pocho whose Spanish is not as good as yours. I'm the grandson of Mexican immigrants, and a doctor told my parents when I was young to cut all Spanish in the house because I struggle with language. This is something that our country has seen a bigotry towards bilingualism, and that was back in the 60s. So it was really bad back then. But one of the audience members asked, is this novel going to be translated into a Spanish edition?
I have my fingers and toes crossed. I would love that. I'm not in control of that. However, the way translation typically works is, a publisher that publishes Spanish work has to be interested in it. And I think, I think it's at a point where it might be of interest to people because it does cross a lot of cultural boundaries. So yeah, I'm really hoping for a Spanish translation. I've only had one short story ever published in Spanish, but reading is just an amazing thing to be able to read your own work in Spanish. I personally, you give me too much credit, Daniel, for my Spanish, but yeah, I'm Pocho too. I don't think I have the skill set to translate anything into Spanish myself and do it well. But yeah, hopefully in the next year or so, we would see that in
Wonderful
translation.
Well, translation is an art. I know that, and I have a book that's being translated right now, but we're going to have a poet who is bilingual, whose Spanish is his first language, review it and then work on it. So you need
Awesome.
to have if you do go down that road, I urge you to make certain that the person who is working on the translation is in fact a creative writer as well, because I think that adds an important element.
Yeah.
I want to remind the audience members to feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will try to make certain we can get to them. So one of the things that came up certainly in your reading of your excerpt at the beginning is that spiritual and mystical experiences run throughout your novel. Sometimes they, actually happen. Sometimes they don't. I'm thinking of a situation where one of the young women really wanted to have a stigmata,
Yeah.
but I won't give any spoilers. But whether or not that happens is you can discover when you read the novel. But as a writer myself who explores many of these concepts, can you share some of your thoughts on including the spiritual and the mystical in your novel?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I would say the question for me is, why do you include it? Right. I have that asked, and in the flip side of it is, I don't think I could write anything where I don't. And the reason being is I come from a very large family with a variety of faith traditions. In my family, we have very traditional Catholics. We have charismatic Catholics. We have, non-denominational Christians, all across, the array of experiences. Myself, I'm a Christian. And so to me, when I think about the family that I'm writing, which is very similar to families in the Rio Grande Valley, that's a very important part of who we are. And for me to not write about that, it would actually be, because of where I'm writing from and the people I'm writing about, it would be inauthentic in some ways. So I have to include that. And then the other thing, when you talk about, and you mentioned it earlier before we started recording, I believe is when you talk about the mystical, you talk about things that happen. And I see a comment, somebody talked about magic realism. For us, and for me, I'll just speak for myself, and culturally speaking of the, where I come from, is the veil between what we see and what we don't see is very thin. It's gauze-like.
Yes.
And it's, to us, it's not, it's almost normal every day, because you hear stories and you see things and you hear things. And it's not as wild as we see it. Once we actually see it on the page, it's like, wow, there's something going on here. But these are things I've been hearing growing up for years. So I would just say that to not include it, I would be not remiss per se, but I would be leaving out a substantial part of my own lived experience.
Amen. And I approach it the same way. Exactly the same way. Some of my stories are explicitly magical. Flat out magical. But just because a narrative includes spiritual or mystical elements doesn't make it magical realism. I mean, magical realism is a very specific thing.
Yes.
And I think some reviewers get a little confused, and particularly if they don't understand the culture. So, you know, I'm curious. I often tell young people, if you want to be a writer, you got to read. You know, read, and then you get a sense of what works for you, what you like, and then that's how you start to absorb, you know, different techniques and different different styles. Who are some of the authors who helped shape you as a writer, particularly with respect, if you can tie it to the creation of this novel?
Yeah, that's a tough. I'll tell you who my favorite author is, and I'm not afraid to say it is authors usually are very afraid to say like who they are, but my favorite author is Luis Alberto Rea.
Yes.
I read his work and I'm like, you know what? I just need to give up right now. Because he's so good.
Well, I have to tell you, when I was reading this novel, and I know he blurbed your book, I could feel his spirit in this book, which is a high compliment to you, you know, as a writer. So,
so I would say, like influence wise, he's at the top of the list. But you know, I come from experiencing the Chicanas of the 90s. So you had Ana Castillo, you had Sandra Cisneros, not just the Chicanas, you had the Latinas, you know, the Laura Esquivel and you know, Isabel Allende. You had all these Latinas, Chicanas writing stories, and they were getting it done, you know, and just writing wonderful work that inspired me. And then so moving forward, so not just as Chicano Latino literature, but I have other writers, like for short stories with ZZ Packer. She wrote a book in the 90s, I believe it was in the late 90s, Drinking Coffee Elsewhere. That amazing book. I learned a lot of craft from those short stories. And then of course, you know, my other favorite author is Oscar Cáceres, who wrote Brownsville Stories, and he's writing about the other end of my little region here, the Rio Grande Valley, Brownsville. So he's another one of my top authors. And then just people that are doing the work right now. You know, you have Disha Filia, you have Donnie Walton, you have you know, Kali Fajardo Einstein writing wonderful books. There's just so many inspirational authors. And it's like when I started in the 90s, I had to like really search for this stuff, and we didn't have the internet. We had to go to a bookstore and go to libraries, and then we had to ask around. And you just look now, and there's just this whole wealth of people to be inspired by. And of course, yourself, sir. If you all have not read Danielle's work, you need to pick up How to Date a Flying Mexican, because it's funny how our books are almost in conversation with one another. And I was like, we should do a panel on levitation in books.
Yes. We should.
Right, because I have that in mine and you have that in yours, and we have very different approaches to it, but still it's there, you know. It's great.
Yes, and it's levitation, not flying, remember.
Yeah, not flying.
No,
not flying.
planes fly, mosquitoes fly, people levitate.
Yeah, people levitate. I love that line.
And there's Sergio Troncoso, also a wonderful writer.
Oh yeah, that's another. I don't want to leave him out too, because Sergio Troncoso also getting the work done and just writing great stuff.
Right, and Rich Yanez. I mean, we have these wonderful writers, and now you are coming so much into your own, not just as a writer in general, but as a Texas writer. I mean, part of a long tradition of writers coming out of Texas who are, you know, talking about culture, talking about our roots in Mexico in a way that is just so powerful and beautiful. One person asked, in your high school or college classes, did you read novels about the Hispanic culture and community? I'm just curious. Great
question. I didn't read I didn't see myself in fiction till I was in college.
Mhm.
In high school, I read voraciously, secretly, because it wasn't
Mhm.
super cool, right? I was kind of hiding a book, but I read a lot. I was
Mhm.
reading Kurt Vonnegut, Tom Robbins,
Mm.
all kinds of Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test,
Mhm.
all these books that nobody was reading, but On the Road, Jack Kerouac, all these things. But I didn't see myself as a Chicano until I got to college, and like I said, I started discovering the Latinas and the Chicanas, who were very popular at the time. They kind of exploded all at the same time, within the 5 to 10 years of each other. So that was really like the first time. And then as far as classes go, like there was never like a Chicano Latino lit class. I had to discover it for myself. So that was something for me that it was just, like I said, it was self-discovery. It was me going to the bookstores in San Antonio, going wherever I could to find this work. And like I said, this is pre-internet. There was no
Mhm.
Google to speak of. We just had to go find out for ourselves.
Because I am older than you are. I've been a member of ARP now for well over 20 years. I have to tell you, in the 60s and 70s, our reading lists, I mean, we had wonderful writers we read, but of course, none of them looked like like us. And it wasn't
Mhm.
until my son went to middle school and high school, then he started getting books on his reading list, by Sandra Cisneros and Rudy Anaya. It started happening
Yeah.
more and more, and that's important. Someone asked in the chat, have either of us read Gordo by Jaime Cortez? I haven't read it yet. But it's I know it's a California Book Club choice, and I am going to get my hands on it. Have you read?
I haven't
Gordo
read
yet?
that yet. Yeah, I've got a big list. That's one of the books I haven't read yet.
That's one of the problems, is that there's so many wonderful books
Yeah.
out there, and what a problem to have. So, this brings me to a question that is may be difficult to answer. I don't know. When did you decide that you wanted to be a writer?
I would say probably in high school. I always kept a composition book that I would write in, and they were terrible poems. And I've told my wife that should I meet an untimely end, these are never to see. She's my literary executor. I said, these are never to see the light of day. But I would write really bad poems, terrible poems about love and nuclear war and all these things that were very important to me. And then I got into college.
Wait, hold on. About love and nuclear war.
Yeah. Like I conflated the two somehow, I don't know why.
Well, it's nuclear war.
It was
Well,
important to
whatever.
me.
Okay, yeah. It's maybe it's a metaphor. I don't know.
So I would write these poems, and then I wrote when I got into college, I submitted a poem, again, not a great poem, but a poem nevertheless, to our literary magazine, which was like, in hindsight, it wasn't a big deal, but to me, it was like I was getting a story published in the New Yorker or something, right? So then I wrote a short story, and I got it published. So I did that poem first, and then the next year I did a short story. I got it published, and Danielle, I won second place. Second place I won, and they gave out, like, there was a little award ceremony in front of a classroom, right? They had cookies and coffee and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got my prize money, and it was $20.
Mm-hmm.
So I got $20. So that was like the first time I was a paid writer. And from that moment on, I was hooked, baby. Like, I'm a writer now. I write these stories, making $20 a pop. I can do this for the rest of my life, I thought. So that's when I really first started, and that's when the bug hit me. And then I started I started getting braver and better, and I started submitting to literary magazines, and I started seeing success at that point. Yeah, that's when I got started.
Well, remind me, do you have an MFA, or what is your educational background?
I have a BA in
Mhm.
English.
Mhm.
And then I went on to be a teacher, and I have a master's in educational administration. I don't have an MFA.
Okay.
As far as a writer, like writer training, I'm mostly self-taught. I think I took one creative writing class in college as an undergrad, but other than that, I don't have an MFA now.
Yeah, and same here. And for any budding writers out there, you do not need an MFA. I majored in English in college too. Same
Yeah.
thing. I have a law degree, and maybe going to law school taught me magical realism. I don't know. The law can be very strange.
Yeah.
It's where you can turn black into white with a few sentences.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, and maybe you sort of responded to this question already. When did you realize the power of language?
That's a big question. When did I realize? I'll say this, and it's a roundabout way of answering your question. When I realized the power of my own language was when just a few years ago, I was writing a short story, and it was the first time that I made myself cry in writing it. And it was a very powerful moment for me. It's a story that I got published in a young adult anthology, and it's about a homeless girl. And she gets to a school. She's gone from school to school, has not really been accepted. And then she gets to this very special school where they care about the kids. And I thought about all the students I had ever taught, and all the ones that just needed an extra caring heart in their lives. And to me, when I felt that emotional connection, and I felt enough emotion to actually start crying as I was thinking about this young lady as I was writing her story, I thought, if I'm reading that, and I'm because I'm not a very emotional person that way, it's harder for me. That's when I realized that the written word, we do have a lot of power when we write it. And as one of my characters, Maggie, says, we have the words of life and death, the power of life and death in our words. And so I think every day, we have to realize, are we going to edify? Are we going to lift people up with our words? Or are we going to tear them down? And for me, it's every time we're going to lift them up as much as possible.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Which reminds me of one of the questions I wanted to ask you. What have your readers, how have they responded to your writing? Are there any stories you can tell us about readers expressing what they thought about something that you wrote?
What I have seen and what I've heard from people about, I'll just talk about this book in particular, is that a lot of the comments I've read, and I don't read good reviews widely, and I don't recommend any author do that per se, but what I have heard is that a lot of the readers are seeing themselves, they're seeing their families, they're seeing the interactions. When they're picking up the book, they're feeling like home. And I'm not just talking about Chicano people. I'm hearing from people from all different cultures and cultural heritages saying that they're feeling a connection to this family that makes them think about their own. So that's been like one of the most positive things I've heard as people are reading the Family Izquierdo.
Yes, I mean, that's, someone said that reading literature can help you feel as though you're not alone in this world. And I know when I first read James Joyce, when I read Dubliners, I felt like, this is a Chicano writer. I just totally connected with the people.
Yes.
John Fonte, who was Irish American and wrote about LA in his fiction. And those writers are Chicano writers, as far as I'm concerned, because you can connect with their experiences. So
and James Joyce especially. I hadn't even thought of that, but that was one of the books, like The Dead. I read that short story the dead. And after I read that, I was just blown away by what could be done on the written page. So and I said, I realized, and then I started thinking, like Host. It's funny that you mentioned that. I don't know if you remember Host. It's the story about Mother's Day and hearing the music. And in some ways that story was my homage to James Joyce's The Dead. I don't know if you go back and read it, you might see some connections there, that there's a connection to the dead, that the dead kind of walk among us, even though, we may not see them.
Someone said we obviously never had a Texas governor in our class, in your class.
I don't even know how to take that, but I'll laugh at it anyway.
Yes, the world is a strange place. We can talk politics, but we won't.
Right. Thank you for that. That's funny.
We have about 5 minutes, but I'd like to. So I have more questions, but okay. Someone asked in the chat, "Are you now a full-time writer?"
Oh. And you're laughing at that like I'm laughing at that.
I mean, it's like people don't know. Non-writers don't know how little we.
Yeah. No, I'm not. I love that question. We like to show people. We like to pretend that we are. I think a lot of times. But no, I have a full-time job. I work, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 job, 8 to 4:30 job, or whatever. I write on Saturdays in the morning, Sunday afternoons. Sometimes if I have time in the afternoon, I'll jot a few things down, but no, I work full time. I'd like to write full time, but I also like having a job. That's the other thing too. And I think about writers like poets like William Carlos Williams was a physician. He was a doctor full time and wrote these beautiful, memorable poems that none of us will ever forget. But maintain that full-time job, was not an academic at all. So I still appreciate that, being in the world and experiencing things, and also bringing that to the page.
Right. And also, my view is that because I make my living as a lawyer, full-time lawyer, I love the work I do. It's environmental enforcement. I work for the government, but my writing is something that I don't need to put bread on the table, by doing. So it's a pure artistic expression for me.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it, and beautiful.
So we're coming to the end. So let me try to squeeze in at least one more question. Can you talk a little bit about your publishing experience with regard to your novel, The Family Izquierdo, and any advice that you might have for those budding writers out there?
Oh yeah, I got some good advice for y'all. Y'all ready for this? Okay. So I talked about my publishing journey, and I started writing very early, and then I submitted my novel several times, didn't get published. My first novel, Above Me, there, kept trying to get published. I had a series of short stories that weren't published. And at the same time, I was becoming a dad, and I was becoming a school administrator, school principal. And I pretty much prayed, and I said, this is going to go one of two directions. I'm going to be successful at the writing, or I'm going to build my career as an administrator. And it seemed to go towards the administrative side, and I was building on that career. And so for a number of years, my pen dried up, and my belief in myself as a writer dissipated, to where I essentially, without, using the strongest terms, but I gave up on myself as a writer in a lot of ways. And so number of years, I would write a short story, maybe every 2 to 3 years, something, I'd send it out, but it was half-hearted. And I quit subscribing to Poets and Writers magazine because it would just depress me, seeing all these people get published. And then in 2015, I had this book that was never published, The Throw, and I sent it out again to an editor friend of mine that I'd been published with before in a journal. Didn't hear back from him for a while, and then all out of the blue, Greg Wolf, good friend of mine, amazing editor, said, "Is this still available? Are you?" And I'm like, "Sure, by all means, check it out. It's, nobody else wants it, is what I was thinking in my head. And then within 3 days, he got back to me and said, you know what, I think we could do this. And so it was like the light came back on after decades of just, having given up on it. And so at 47, I published my first book, and then it gave me courage, encouraged me to go out and say, okay, you know what, I have this other book I've been sitting on, all these stories that I've been sitting on. I'm going to put them in a collection, and I'm going to submit to an agent. And so I submitted via Twitter. There's a Twitter pitch event called Pit Mad and DV Pit, where you pitch your story in one tweet. And then I did that. And if somebody likes it, an agent likes it, that means they want you to send them a full or send them a letter, a query letter. So I sent that. And then on my fifth try, I got an agent. So this is like after 25 years of 20 years or so of nothing, I got an agent on the fifth try. And then within 6 months, we had an offer on the book. So,
Wow.
I was in a literary desert for decades. And then all of a sudden, boom, 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 all these things started happening. And it's just been a whirlwind. So my encouragement to you, either as a starting writer, which doesn't mean you're a young writer, or somebody who maybe wants to debut as an older author, is don't give up. Keep it up, keep believing in it. I never would have thought that anything I wrote would be this well received, that I'd be getting a New York Times review. And believe me, I am not all that. I had lots of years of I don't want to say failure, but obscurity, certainly. So definitely don't give up on it. Keep doing it. It's just a matter of timing and finding the right person. That's really all it is timing, finding the right person. And when it happens, it will happen.
Well, plus talent and a lot of hard work. So
yeah, that too.
We're delighted that you did not give up. What a perfect way to end this conversation. Rubén Degollado, the author of this beautiful novel, The Family Izquierdo, published by W.W. Norton. I urge everyone who's watching to please get this novel. You will be delighted by it. It will make you laugh. It will make you cry. Rubén, many, many years of success to you, and I'm delighted to be part of this. Karen, I throw it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Rubén and Daniel, for joining us tonight. It was a very interesting and I wouldn't say entertaining, but it felt a lot more wholesome and present than entertainment. So I want to thank you for that. It was really wonderful to hear you both talk about your craft and about your book. So I'm really looking forward to reading both of them now, and haven't had a chance yet. So thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.